Before we get into the thumbnails, let's quickly talk about shapes. Here we have a few examples of basic shapes. We can use these shapes to communicate different ideas. Let's talk about each shape and the general association we have from it. The circle is friendly, calm, soft, and positive. The square is stable, strong, and rigid. And the triangle conveys speed, action, contrast, tension, and sometimes danger. Now, these are all general and somewhat subjective, but I think most people would be able to see the visual differences and the feeling that they give to the viewer. Same thing happened with lines. A horizontal line is more calm. A vertical line is strong and stable, similar to the square, and a diagonal line show more contrast, movement, and danger, similar to the triangle. All you need to remember from all of this is you need to ask yourself when you're drawing, do you want to show more contrast or less contrast? Now I'm going to be creating 3 thumbnails, starting with this one. And with this one, what I'm trying to do is create a thumbnail that doesn't have a lot of contrast or tension. Maybe just a little bit so it's not boring. So I'm starting with my foreground, midground, and background. I have the focal point for this thumbnail are these circular mountains or round mountains. Now usually you'd want something more interesting for the focal point, but for the purpose of this tutorial it's gonna be just fine. Also adding a small character here for a sense of scale and maybe a secondary focal point, but nothing too fancy. And right now I'm gonna start working on my foreground a little bit, creating some landmarks on the foreground. Try to think of what kind of a material it is, if it's rocks or like dirt or something, but also thinking about leading the eye to my focal point. Keeping in mind the light direction. And when I do thumbnails, I don't really get into all the details. I'm trying to create something super fast that just gets the point across. No need to get into all the rendering, all the details that you're gonna have in the final piece. Now I'm working on the midground and I'm trying to continue leading the eye to the main focal point, these mountains. Also, again, making sure the light direction is consistent. And you can see with the clouds, what I did is I tried to keep it horizontal, so I'm not really creating that much contrast with it. And that's it. You can see the circular shapes in the foreground rocks and in the mountains. The clouds and the foreground plane creating horizontal lines, and there's a little bit of an angle between the foreground plane and the midground for some interest. But overall there isn't a lot of tension here. Now I'm basically gonna take the same thumbnail, the same idea, and I'm gonna try to push the tension and the contrast with that. So I'm gonna be thinking about the shape language, maybe play with the horizon line and the camera angle to achieve that. So you can see here I'm creating a lot more angular and vertical shapes for the rocks, both in the foreground and in the midground. Playing around with the shape of the clouds, always thinking about the elements in terms of shapes first and then what it actually is. So the relationships between the shapes Alright, so this is the second one. In this one, the circular shapes of the rocks and mountains turn into a bunch of triangles, and the foreground plane is higher. There are some round shapes created by the clouds which relieve some of the tension, but there are a lot of angles created by the negative space between the shapes, so overall, this reads as a more dynamic and dangerous environment. Now I'm gonna do a third version, still the same idea exactly, and I'm gonna try and create a lot more tension with this. Again, using the same ideas, not really changing the light too much, just playing with shapes and the camera angle and maybe size relationships to make it more dramatic. So I'm really making these mountains a lot bigger, a lot more epic, and more angular. I'm really going for graphic, readable shapes, and usually, if it becomes too graphic, then later on when I'm working on the final version, then I'm gonna add more realism to it. But I like starting with really graphic shapes. I think it gives the final version, it makes it more interesting, more dynamic, instead of thinking about these mountains as something super realistic. And I'm going with this fog just to create a bit of a different atmosphere. And that's it. The triangles here have more extreme angles, which creates more contrast and negative space between the shapes. This and the fact that the character is a lot smaller gives this environment an even more dramatic feel and a great sense of danger. So here you can see all three of them again. Super simple thumbnails just to get the point across. Here we used more horizontal lines and round shapes, so not a lot of contrast. Then we move to here, a bit more contrast, more angular shapes, and more angles in general. And then we ended up here with a lot more angles and a lot more contrast and epic feeling to the thumbnail. Again, we didn't really change anything with the idea. We could have played with it a lot more, but this was just to get a point across of how you can use shapes when you're doing thumbnails.